4:40 AM on the 21st of March 1918, German guns roared out across the Western Front. In just a few hours, more than 1 million shells slammed into British 3rd and 5th Army positions on the Somme. Operation Michael, the first in a series of brutal assaults, collectively known as the Spring Offensive, had begun. Over the course of the coming days and weeks, the Allies would fall back a staggering 40 miles towards the vital city of Amiens. Although they weren't to know it, Australian troops would once again enter the fray to thwart that German plan at a little-known town called Villers Bretonneux. By March 1918, the old British Expeditionary Force of 1914 was long gone, replaced by 5 armies, millions strong, which boasted men from all over the empire, including, of course, Australia. Thus far, it had been the Allies that had sought the offensive on the Western Front, desperate to drive the Germans out of France and Belgium. But in early 1918, uncharacteristically, it was the Allies, and the British in particular, who were turning to a defensive posture. And here's why. The capitulation of Russia in 1917 was a huge blow to the Entente powers at a time when they were trying to recover from significant battles of attrition in the previous 18 months. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on the 3rd of March 1918, confirmed the ceding of huge tracts of land and resources to the Germans. But more importantly, the end of fighting in the East was already freeing up much needed manpower, more than 1 million men who were now heading for the Western Front. In an opposite sense, the Allies were the ones facing a manpower crisis at that time. Britain had turned to conscription in early 1916, but was now struggling to maintain a regular intake. With the British taking on ever more trench lines from the war-weary French and having to send troops to shore up the unstable Italian front following the disastrous Battle of Caporetto, manpower was a real issue. As a result, in early 1918, British brigades were reduced to 3 battalions rather than 4, which meant that British divisions had 3,000 less infantrymen. Added to that, the British had just taken on another 28 miles of front line from the French on the south of their sector, and those defences were in a very poor state. There was then a window of opportunity for the Germans to take the offensive, and for 2 reasons they needed to do it quickly. Firstly, the ever-increasing effect of the British naval blockade was having a massive impact on Germany's home front. And secondly, and here's the big one, although the United States had declared war on Germany in April 1917, it had yet to bring its huge force to bear. But the Yanks were coming, and General Ludendorff knew that when they arrived, the fate of the German army would be sealed, and all hope for victory would be lost. So what was the Australian Corps up to in early 1918? The 5 Australian divisions, previously split between the 1st and 2nd Anzac Corps, had come together to form one dedicated Australian Corps in November 1917, under the command of Lieutenant General Birdwood. In early 1918, they were resting in the Messines sector south of Ypres, which really meant holding the line from Hollebeke in the north, through the famous Plug Street Wood and down to Armentières. They were training new replacements, getting as much recreation as possible and trying to get back up to strength. Incidentally, at the point when Australians at home were voting no to conscripted service overseas for the 2nd time. They formed part of General Henry Rawlinson's 4th Army. The Corps looked something like this. The 1st Australian Division under Major General Harold Walker, the 2nd Division under Major General Neville Maskelyne Smith, the 3rd under Major General John Monash, the 4th Major General Ewan Sinclair McLagan, and the 5th Australian Division Major General Sir Joseph Talbot Hobbs. Let's take a moment to remind ourselves about the structure of a typical Australian division in 1918, who importantly had not been reduced in strength like British divisions, though through the slowing of volunteer enlistment back home were certainly not as strong as they appeared on paper. The most basic unit in the First World War was the section, made up of usually 12 men and led by a corporal. 4 sections made up a platoon of around 50 men under the command of a lieutenant or 2nd lieutenant with a sergeant assisting. 4 platoons made up a company, officially 227 men, often commanded by a major or a captain. Those 4 companies, along with the machine gun section, battalion headquarters, and various specialist troops, made a battalion. Commanded by a lieutenant colonel, it was, on paper at least, around 30 officers and 1,000 men in all. For most of the war, 4 battalions formed a brigade, commanded, unsurprisingly, by a brigadier general. Again, with various attached troops, it was about 4,000 men in total. Finally, 3 brigades, usually, made a division. Commanded by a major general, this consisted of a total of 12 infantry battalions, 3 field artillery brigades, 2 engineer field companies, 1 signal company, 1 divisional ammunition column, 3 field ambulances, and various additional specialist troops. All told, a complement of some 16 to 18,000 men. So, Flanders was, as far as the Western Front could be, fairly quiet in March 1918, and the Australians conducted many trench raids against the German positions opposite, sneaking across no man's land by night to try and snatch prisoners and gather intelligence on the German intentions for the spring offensive. This was happening up and down the British lines, and the information gained was fed into GHQ, who projected, correctly as it happens, that the German offensive would start on either the 20th or the 21st of March. It was then, early in the morning of the 21st of March 1918, under a blanket of fortuitous fog, that General von Ludendorff launched his last-ditch attempt to knock the British out of the war. The attack was aimed along the weakest part of the British line, where the British 5th Army met the 3rd Army north of Saint-Quentin. Over 10,000 guns and mortars fired a staggering 3.2 million shells in 5 hours. Then 76 divisions poured over the start line and swept all asunder. The main hammer blow fell on General Hubert Gough's 5th Army, holding part of the weakly fortified Old French line. Ludendorff's plan was to split the British and French armies where they met in the Amiens area. He hoped that by using stormtroops, massive high explosive artillery barrages and huge amounts of gas, that the British could be pushed back to the Channel in a knockout blow and the French would capitulate. It was a good start, and although there were pockets of resistance and staunch fighting retirements, the 5th Army would be pushed back over 40 miles to the gates of Amiens over the next 2 weeks. So how did the Aussies get involved? On the Australian sector in Flanders on the 21st of March, there had been no reported German activity until 5:25 am, when suddenly a huge barrage opened up and attempts were made by the Germans to infiltrate across the British lines. At around 10 am, news of the German bombardment further south reached the Australian Corps headquarters. That evening, the full impact of the attack was revealed. This must have been a terrible blow to the Australians, as they heard that on the first day the Germans were advancing across the Bullecourt and Lagnicourt battlefields on which so many of their comrades had fallen the year before. As a result of the breakthrough on the Somme, the Australians, amongst others, were to be rushed south to fill the dangerous gaps appearing all along the front. Let's take a look. The road to Villers Bretonneux was not a straightforward one. Both the 3rd and 4th Australian divisions were moving south by the 24th of March, but not directly to the Somme. After many orders and counter-orders were received, they eventually moved into reserve between Arras and Amiens, and were gradually scattered here and there to plug the gaps where the Germans threatened in the 3rd Army sector. Over the coming days, further Australian units would follow suit, holding key ground on the northern side of the River Somme in hopes of stemming the German tide. But by 6 p.m. on the 27th of March, a crisis has suddenly arisen in the battle as a whole. The retiring 5th Army south of the Somme was still much further to the east and was in danger of being outflanked from the north bank of the Somme, where the 3rd Army had retired to the River Ancre. The Germans were seen crossing the Somme at Cerisy and heading west towards Corbie and Warfusset, which was on the Roman road leading directly to Amiens. The following day, Monash, while still trying to advance his main line towards Morlancourt and Sailly-Lorette, committed his last brigade, the 9th, under the command of Brigadier General Charles Rosenthal, to move southwest down to Corbie to join the British 1st Cavalry Division to cover the bridges along the river and counter the new threat. This would place Rosenthal's formation just 5 kilometres north of a small town on the Roman road, Villers Bretonneux. Confused? Well, you're not alone. The The entire situation in late March 1918 was one of total confusion, with units rushing back and forth trying to hold stretches of line, hilltops, riverbanks, all the time trying to ascertain exactly where the enemy were, and even where their own friendly troops were. In short, it was chaotic. At this time, other snippets of news were coming in. The Germans had started another offensive, Operation Mars, against the Third Army up toward Arras. General Gough had been dismissed, the Fifth Army had been dissolved, and now its remnant divisions would be gathered up by Fourth Army under General Rawlinson. To top it all off, it was announced that Marshal Ferdinand Foch was to take command as the new Generalissimo of all Allied forces. By now, General Joseph Talbot Hobbs' 5th Division had also arrived in the Somme area, and its 15th Brigade under Brigadier General Pompey Elliott moved in to take over guarding the bridges at Corbie. This was because at 5:40 p.m, Rosenthal's 9th Brigade, whom will now follow, was immediately ordered to head towards Villers Bretonneux. So why was Villers Bretonneux so important? Well, in short, it was the last major defensive position in front of the vital Allied supply hub of Amiens. With high ground, namely Hill 104 to its northeast, it was also a superb observation platform for artillery spotters firing into the city. If it could be taken, there was a very real chance Amiens would fall. So by the 30th of March, the 9th Australian Brigade had arrived here, in support behind Villers Bretonneux, with its 4 New South Wales battalions, the 33rd under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Morshead, Lieutenant Colonel Martin's 34th, the 35th under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Goddard, and the 36th commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Milne. Let's take a look at the area today and understand how things lay at that crucial time. The 9th Australian Brigade was initially deployed here around the village of Cachy and the Bois-l'Abbé to the southwest of Villers Bretonneux. The River Somme is on the left. Here, on the Roman road, is Warfusset village, which was roughly how far the Germans had got by the 30th of March. Hangard Wood and the River Luce are the other features to note on the right. It's also important to understand between the end of March and the 4th of April, no major German assaults were made in this sector, as the Germans took time to build up their combat strength and rest their exhausted men. This crucially allowed the Australians time to prepare for the inevitable assault. Over the next 5 days, Rosenthal's battalions were used a number of times to probe out to the German line or relieve some of the exhausted British units just to the east of Villers Bretonneux. They also developed a new reserve trench known as Cachy Switch, just to the southwest of the town. But let's have a look at the situation on the morning of the 4th of April. The British 14th Light Division held the line from Seille-Lorette to the River Somme, passing Les Hamelles to the east and down to the Roman road to the west of Warfusset, where the Australian 35th Battalion took over as it ran southwest to the Chaulnes-Amiens Railway, where the 18th Division held the line down to the River Luce to the east of Hangard Wood. Beyond that stood the French army. Both the British divisions in this sector had only just come into the line and had been reconstituted after suffering terribly in the previous fighting. They also had very limited artillery support. From an Australian perspective, Brigadier Rosenthal had delegated command of his brigade to the officer commanding the 35th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Goddard, whose headquarters was on the railway line just to the east of Villers Bretonneux, and he knew that he would be responsible for the inevitable defence of the town. The 33rd Australian Battalion sat in support about 500 yards back, and the 34th and 36th occupied the town itself. At around 5:30 am on the 4th of April, a heavy bombardment was put down by the Germans on the Allied front lines and the villages behind. Villers Bretonneux was pounded with high explosive shells and smothered with gas. An hour later, there came an eerie lull as the haze of the shell smoke cleared. 3 regiments of the 9th Bavarian Reserve Division threw themselves astride the Roman road towards the Allied lines. The 35th Battalion and the 18th Division in the centre and on the right repulsed the Germans with heavy rifle and Lewis gun fire a number of times through the morning. But in the north, where the opening bombardment had been heaviest, the 14th Division gave ground and were forced to fall back. Goddard, watching the attack unfold, now committed 3 companies of the 33rd Battalion to go forward at 8:15, and at 9 am he sent the last, C Company, under Captain Walter Duncan, who was renowned as a first-rate fighting leader. He positioned his men to pour withering fire into the enemy to the north of the road and drove them to ground. For this, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Later, the left flank was supported by the 1st Royal Dragoons and the 6th Cavalry Brigade on his left, who managed to link up with the retiring 14th Division and check the advance, but Amiens was in German hands by midday. The left of the 18th Division also started to buckle, and this meant the 35th Battalion was in real danger of being surrounded. Despite huge efforts by all frontline troops to hold the line, in the late afternoon they were finally outflanked and had to fall back on Villers Bretonneux. With some forethought, Brigadier Rosenthal had brought his last 2 battalions forward. The 34th now stood to the northwest of the town and the 36th immediately to the south of it. It was at 5 PM that the critical moment came. The 9th Bavarians were now only 400 yards southeast of Villers Bretonneux, and Godard's own headquarters was in imminent danger of being overrun. It was now that the 36th Battalion came to the rescue. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Milne, was told in no uncertain terms to attack. With the British 6th Londons willingly agreeing to join the advance, Milne also knew that the British 7th Queens would stand and fight on his right. Milne raced to his headquarters and ordered his company commanders to assemble at the double. His orders were brief.
The enemy has broken through in our immediate front and we must counterattack at once. Bushell, your company will be in the left. Rod, B company will be in the centre. Tedder, C company will take the right, and I shall send immediately to the CO of the Queens and ask him to cooperate. Bazell, your left flank will rest on the railway embankment, the 35th on the other side. Attack in one wave. D company, under Captain Gatt. I shall hold you in reserve here on the sunken road. Get ready, there's no time to lose. Go until you're stopped and hold on at all costs.
As the Australians took to their start line, Milne walked along it and famously said, "Goodbye boys, it's neck or nothing." At 5:45 PM, with bayonets fixed, the line went forward just as the Bavarians were moving from their positions in Monument Wood. They initially recoiled but soon rallied and opened up a machine gun fire directly in front of B Company, but both B and C companies managed to advance under cover of the railway embankment. Seeing this, the reserves of the battalion crossed to the north side of the railway to join in the charge. They were bolstered by some of the retiring 33rd, who had also turned to fight alongside the remnants of the 34th who'd come down from the north. Advancing only as Australians could, they forced the enemy back against all odds, driving either side of the railway line, and despite heavy machine gun fire, eventually reached this position, identifiable today by the faint outline of the wartime roads still seen crisscrossing the fields. It was now that an unusual but welcome sight, British cavalry, came up to support the thin Australian line. Lieutenant Colonel Morshead said the following: "Seeing them gallop into action with swords and lances drawn and moving quickly to where help was most needed enthused our men tremendously." The advance was eventually stopped, and the line, now back out to 2,000 yards from the town, was consolidated overnight, and for now, Villers Bretonneux had been saved. But the cost was high, with 665 of the brigade's 2,250 men becoming casualties. During the night and the following day, the 2nd Australian Division, which had now also been moved down from Flanders, and the 5th Australian Division were coming to the line to shore up the defences. On the 5th of April, the 3rd and 4th Australian Divisions were also heavily engaged north of the Somme, but they too held on. On the 9th of April, the Germans opened up another offensive, Operation Georgette, on the River Lys in Flanders, and the 1st Australian Division was sent to stem the tide at Hazebrouck. The whole of the Australian Corps was now engaged in the Kaiser's battle, and there was bitter fighting yet to come. By now, the line south of the Somme looked something like this. The 5th Australian Division held the river from the Somme down to Villers Bretonneux. The garrison in the town was the 33rd Battalion of the 9th Brigade and the 6th Londons of the 58th Division. The 18th Division held the line down to the south, which included the 5th Australian Brigade of the 2nd Division opposite Hangard Wood, and finally, the 8th Brigade of the 5th Australian Division stood on the right flank next to the French. Over the next few weeks, there would be many attacks and counterattacks as attempts were made to straighten the line to protect Villers Bretonneux, which was the key to holding Amiens. One of note was the taking of Hangar Wood by the 5th Australian Brigade on the 7th of April, where Lieutenant Percy Storkey of the 19th Battalion, at the head of a group of 11 men, drove the enemy from their positions, killing and wounding about 30 and capturing 3 officers, 50 men and 1 machine gun. For his gallantry, Storkey was awarded the Victoria Cross. But by mid-April, the Germans were once again preparing to attack. At 4 AM on the 17th, they unleashed a vicious artillery bombardment. Villers Bretonneux was drenched with gas shells. Mustard, phosgene and diphenylchlorothene, a sneezing powder which caused men to remove their gas masks, were all used, with shells landing at a rate of 1 every 2 seconds throughout a 3-hour bombardment. Australian gas casualties in that bombardment amounted to over 600, some of those men being captured here in this iconic photograph. The gas attacks were early indications that the Germans were preparing an assault, and this was happening just as a period of reorganisation in this sector was being made, with the Australians being replaced by the British 8th Division in front of the town. The relief was complete by the 21st of April, the day that Baron Manfred von Richthofen was shot down, probably by Australian troops, near the north bank of the River Somme. By now, the line looked like this: the 5th Australian Division in the north, the 8th Division covering Villers Bretonneux, and the 57th holding the south. The Germans also had reorganised, and had recently brought the 77th Reserve, the 4th Guards and the 228th Divisions into the area, all of which were recognised as Storm Divisions. The attack was coming. At 3:45 AM on the 24th of April, as the early morning fog grew dense, a tremendous bombardment fell on a sector from Hangar Wood to 1,500 metres north of Villers Bretonneux, which included the line held by the Australian 29th Battalion. For the 8th Division men holding Villers Bretonneux, that bombardment was a nightmarish experience, as Lieutenant Mason recalled. It was a most horrible ruin, a revolting sign of torn and gutted houses and littered streets, littered too with dead here and there amongst the splintered glass, smouldering beams and heaps of bricks. It was worse than a town obliterated, like Ypres, for example. Ypres was a bleached skeleton. Villers was being mutilated in death. The assault this time would involve using the Germans' most recent piece of acquired technology, the tank. At 5:50 AM, 13 A7V tanks split into 3 groups, crashed through the lines, 3 north of the railway line towards Villers Bretonneux, 6 south of the railway and 4 opposite Cachy. The infantry followed through the fog at 6 AM, with some using flamethrowers. At the top of the line, the 29th Australian Battalion had seen off the initial attack, but wherever the tanks broke through further south, the infantry surged forward, sweeping the defenders aside and forming a pocket 4 miles wide as far as the Bois d'Aquin. Villers Bretonneux, which the Australians had fought so hard to save 3 weeks earlier, had fallen. The nearest Australian units at this time capable of reacting to the 8th Division's plight were the men of Pompey Elliott's 15th Brigade, positioned here to the northwest of Villers Bretonneux. Alerted by the German bombardment, he had sent out patrols at 4:50 AM that morning to ascertain the situation. Villers Bretonneux had to be retaken. The 8th Division too were not done yet. At the same time as desperately shoring up their own line, they were also looking for opportunities to counterattack. One was found at 9:30 AM when 3 tanks of the 1st Tank Battalion were employed just northeast of Cachy in a unique event, the first ever tank-on-tank battle in history. On that morning, 3 British tanks, 2 machine gun armed female Mark IV tanks and 1 6-pounder armed male, commanded by Lieutenant Frank Mitchell, sighted German A7V Nixer and 2 other German tanks advancing. Over the next few minutes, with 2 A7Vs holding back, a firefight erupted at a range of around 300 metres. Realising their machine guns had no effect, both female tanks withdrew, leaving Mitchell's male and Nixer the only 2 vehicles in the fight. After firing more than 25 rounds at the target, Mitchell's gunner finally scored a hit, killing 3 of the 18-man German crew and forcing the rest to abandon the tank. Although Mitchell's tank would also be knocked out by artillery shell fire that day, his crew did become the first in history to destroy an enemy tank. With confusion still reigning across the battlefield, it took time to decide upon the right course of action, but finally a plan was agreed. The 13th Australian Brigade would attack to the south of Villers Bretonneux and the 15th to the north, aiming to cut off and encircle the town's occupiers in a large pincer movement. 0 was set for 10 p.m. Charles Bean, the official Australian war historian, didn't hold out much hope for a successful conclusion.
One cannot help thinking of our magnificent brigades going over as they may be doing now. I don't believe they have a chance. Scarcely think it will come off. Went to bed thoroughly depressed, feeling certain that this hurried attack would fail hopelessly.
As the Australians moved to their start lines in darkness, many recall catching glimpses of the Germans silhouetted in the burning ruins of Villers Bretonneux. It would be an all-or-nothing attack. At 0 hour, the guns roared out as shells began to slam into the town, and the 13th advanced with the British 54th Brigade on its right. Immediately held up by machine gun fire from the WW1 on its left, it was a moment when brute force and initiative was called for. Lieutenant Clifford Sadlier of the 51st Battalion took matters into his own hands. Charging with 9 men against the enemy, he took out 2 machine gun positions despite being wounded and continued on to a third, earning the Victoria Cross in the process. Once incapacitated, his sergeant took up the fight, capturing 3 more positions and opening the route for his men. The southern pincer was advancing well, but could they join up with the men of the 15th Brigade as planned? Let's take a look. Well, no. Due to delays before the attack, the 15th Brigade hadn't even begun their advance until 2 hours later than planned, at midnight, with the 59th and 60th Battalions skirting the northeast of the town. It was now the 25th of April, Anzac Day. According to legend, just after fixing bayonets, the men of the 15th Brigade, closest to the village, let out a banshee-like yell and charged to rout the enemy. An unknown digger left this powerful account.
A storm of enemy machine gun and rifle fire was poured into the oncoming Australian ranks, but check them not at all. 100 enemy flares lit the terrible scene in vivid light, in which the Germans read too well their fate. Shriek following shriek marked the roll of the deadly Australian bayonets, and good round Australian oaths were ripped out in quick succession as the panting men plunged forward to the next victim. The German defences were arranged in a series of strong points distributed in depth. If for a moment the slaughter slackened, it was because new victims were wanted and, in the dark, they were not too easy to see. But soon the enemy flares would shoot up again, and from strong points not yet reached. Those flares were the death warrant of many Germans that night, for, guided by them, the assailants knew exactly where their enemies lay.
By 4 a.m, although there was still a slight gap between the two brigades, Villers Bretonneux was, to all intents and purpose, surrounded. The job of mopping up the Germans in the town began around dawn, with the men of the 22nd Durham Light Infantry from the west and the 2nd Royal Berkshires, with 2 companies of Aussies of the 57th Battalion, sweeping through the shattered streets, killing or capturing defenders at the point of the bayonet. What was left was a confused battlefield, and it took until the early hours of the 26th of April to fill all the gaps in the line and finally subdue all the Germans trapped in the pocket. The final act was completed when a French colonial division, Moroccans, launched a determined attack to the south of Cachy on the 27th of April, stabilising the line, but at a terrible cost. Finally, the battle for Villers Bretonneux was over. The magnificent efforts of the Australians here, supported by many British battalions and tanks, had recaptured Villers Bretonneux. This location would mark the closest that the Germans would advance towards Amiens in that great offensive. But as always, there was a cost. Australian casualties for the 13th and 15th Brigades alone were approximately 1,450 men respectively, killed, wounded and missing. Even to this day, Villers Bretonneux is closely linked with Australia. The town itself is twinned with Robinvale. Street names bear testimony to the fighting undertaken here, and Australia's unknown warrior was disinterred in 1993 from nearby Adelaide Cemetery. Perhaps the most poignant reminder of all is to be found at the school in Villers Bretonneux, rebuilt after the war by funds raised in Australia, mostly from the state of Victoria. More than a century on, the school is still called L'École Victoria. and every day children enter their classrooms under a large sign that declares, "Do not forget Australia." Of course, the story of the Australian Imperial Force on the Western Front will go on, with many more bitter battles to come. If you found this episode interesting, then be sure to check out the other videos in this series to learn more about the Australians in the First World War. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.